it appeared to me that the U-2 people were the most surprised people in the world to find out that plane is up there. The plane was sent by some other motivation, which was very limited.
Something fishy went on here.
Well, I knew because my men were to provide the hydrogen. You see, the difference for me is I lived with the people. I know, like in the case of some of these documents, I've still got the papers that I wrote by hand. I couldn't type very well, so I wrote things by hand. I still got my notes. Hell, I know. I don't have to go find it. But I know they're still telling lies because they won't put the information out. I got this in a note from a person in level of the Office of Secretary of Defense that certain people fixed the plane so it came down, and Gary Powers would know nothing about it.
On May the 1st, 1960, a U-2 unarmed reconnaissance plane took off to fly a spy mission over the Soviet Union. The pilot was Francis Gary Powers, who was employed by the CIA and was claimed to have been shot down by the Soviet military at 70,000 feet, approximately 1,200 miles inside the Soviet Union. In the following days, Nikita Khrushchev exploited the U.S. government's cover story and walked out of the summit meeting in Paris on May 16, 1960. There is a direct relationship between the U-2 incident and the end of U.S. President Eisenhower's crusade for peace. In response to Khrushchev, the U.S. Department of State issued a statement on May 7, 1960 that, insofar as the authorities in Washington are concerned, there was no authorization for any such flight as described by Mr. Khrushchev. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty worked in the Pentagon at that time, and he has a very interesting recollection of this event. What follows are 4 separate interviews regarding Gary Powers' U-2 flight.
It said that the U-2 flights over Russia, the Americans shared the information with the British freely, and in return, the British supplied pilots. I saw a picture, it looked like 10, 15 guys, and evidently they were U-2 pilots, and it claimed that these guys were British.
Well, the British had U-2s.
Oh, their own U-2s? Yeah. Oh, okay.
The U-2 wasn't a CIA thing. They couldn't maintain airplanes. SAC maintained the Air Force. The U-2 selected the targets and the time of going and that sort of thing. But the planes were supported by the military. They were purchased by the military. I made one of the original phone calls simply as a function of my office. Mm-hmm. The system I had furnished supplies for them all to their operation, and it was a professional flight operation, which the CIA was authorized to use for spying purposes. The secret of the U-2 was the camera. Geez, the camera was so advanced that's the U-2 that went down with Powers on it didn't have the U-2 camera. It had an ordinary old bomber camera.
Oh, really?
There was somebody ahead of time selectively had taken the Lundall out and let I even have somewhere the serial number, the one that was on the U-2 that went down, and it wasn't a Lundall. And
that's another telling.
In other words, they were trying so hard to keep the Lundall out of the Soviets' hands that.
But they knew that plane was going down.
Well, that plane had crashed previously. It was landing in Japan and run short of fuel at the base where Oswald was working. At the time he was working there.
At Sugi.
And it bellied in, which didn't hurt. It lands on the belly anyway. It's got a little tiny wheel underneath, but no other wheels. And they brought it to Lockheed, and the Lockheed people rebuilt it. And in the process, it appears, put a different camera in it and maybe some other things to protect secrets. And then that's the plane that flew over the Soviet Union, which is kind of an interesting story.
So to get back to this, the British were able to use those planes, or they bought their own?
I don't know whether they bought them or whether they were
just
made available.
For the job, yeah.
It's just like I was telling you about the Norwegian operation we had, where the planes are based in Norway, but we used non-American pilots a good bit of the time to fly them over the Soviet Union regularly. It's a way clandestine work is done so that it isn't attributable, but of course there's no way you can deny that where a U-2 comes from. So it's got to be an American airplane.
But in that case, Gary Powers was in a uniform or a jumpsuit with information with him.
You know, you did the famous pictures of taken of everything he had in his pockets when he went down. Well, the U-2 pilots didn't have any pockets, for one thing. I mean, I'm going to have a guy that's supposed to be a spy and then equip him with everything else, his club card and his automobile license and all that. And plus the trinkets he was supposed to hand out to bribe people to take care of, and a flag that's saying, I'm a U.S. citizen, I need your help, and escape and evasion kit. Well, that's ridiculous. Well, Powers didn't know that was on the plane. The parachute has two seats. One is the one you sit on, and one is your parachute. It was in between the two seats. Somebody had put his stuff there. They took it from him and said, you're going on a flight. They put it. So when he landed, the Russians found it, and they said, here's what he had with him. What do you mean, tell us you're not an American military pilot? Well, that stuff is contrived. But the facts that came out later prove the whole darn thing was set up that way. He was surprised to find out what they claimed he had on board.
In the facts, I'm not familiar with them. Did he crash land, or did he actually just land?
Well, the distinction in a U-2 is not very great.
Okay.
If you got a runway, it's not a crash. If it's in a field, it is a crash. The underneath of a U-2 has just a small single wheel, and because it's made as light as it can be. In fact, all the pilots called it a glider. And the wreckage that they showed was sent to Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, and he said that wreckage never came from one of our airplanes. It's just some junk they had in Moscow, and took a picture of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the picture of the wreckage of U-2 is not the U-2.
Because they did show big pictures of the cabin and that, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that was
They had the plane. And another thing was that in one of the pictures, the U-2 is shown, and the canopy, the big plastic canopy over the top of the pilot, is laying on the ground, unbroken, not broken. But you couldn't take, it'd be like dropping a glass from 100 feet up, and it didn't break. I mean, they contrived the Russians were trying to prove to the world that they could bring a plane down from 80 or 90,000 feet. And see, that's why they built the plane. They knew at Lockheed that nothing the Russians had could reach the altitude the operating altitude of the airplane. Therefore, it couldn't be brought down. So when the Russians said they did bring it down, the first thing Dulles said to the Fulbright committee was, they couldn't have reached it at its operating altitude. It came down lower, and then they got it. Well, got it means they put MiGs around it, flying with it. Somebody said that there was a reporter over there who was riding on a train or something like that, who wrote a story about the sky was full of MiGs. But
so they just forced him down.
Yeah, that's when he was down low altitude. Well, and of course, his engine wasn't running. His engine had conked out. See, the U-2 had to have special fuel.
Hydrogen?
And the special fuel was combined. The JP fuel, the ordinary fuel we'd use like in an airline airplane, and hydrogen, raw hydrogen. And the hydrogen tank only had half enough. So when it ran out, the plane came down right halfway on the flight.
In the middle.
Yeah, predictable.
Right in the heart of the Soviet Union. But it's your position that Alan Dulles didn't know that they had put all this identification in there, or even that the flight was being run.
Well, I don't think I ever said I wrote that, because
no, you didn't write it.
There's no way to know. It appeared to me that the U-2 people were the most surprised people in the world to find out that plane is up there. The plane was sent by some other motivation, which was very limited, and got it in the air, because my office was across the hall from the U-2 people's office. And I provided support. And that morning when I came to work, their office was bedlam. And I wondered, what's the matter? And finally one of the guys said, we just lost the plane. If they lost the plane, they wouldn't have been all shook up. They would have known it was lost. They were shook up because they didn't know a plane was in the air. That's what bothered them. And another thing you should know about this kind of work is the office directly across from me was called Covert and Deception. Every time there's an operation, you have another office saying all the different ways that it couldn't possibly have happened. Like robbing a bank. Work out your cover story ahead of time. So you go rob the bank, and you have your friend in Las Vegas saying, "Oh no, my friend was with me. We were in room 110, and we couldn't have possibly been robbing a bank. We were out in Las Vegas." You got to have your cover. But this is the way the government would work. It's either you two guys, my office, and the cover people, and we all supported each other. See, I provided the hydrogen, among other things. When I say I don't mean personally. I had a system,
Yeah.
thousands of guys that did these things.
So it's a very small window or group of people who could have ordered that even in the air.
Yeah, that's right. It
Yes.
was very. There was something about somebody that was able to make the phone call that said go, and the guys in the field had no way to cross-check it, and the plane went. So there it was.
So could it have been? So it wasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this the event that stopped the summit meeting, right?
The summit
Between
conference, yeah. Oh, it very definitely was timed at the summit conference, because had that, at that time, if you read, just look at the newspapers before May 1st of 60, you'll see that this coming summit conference was drawing columns by reputable writers that there was going to be a detente between the old war buddies, Khrushchev and Eisenhower, who during World War II were allies, and that they were sort of had the same desire for peace in the world and so on, and that this was going to be their last big deal. And
So it sounds to me like it's more of this high cabal kind of thing, not wanting there to be peace.
exactly,
Essentially.
yeah, exactly. And the timing is the clue,
Right.
because it's just like in Kennedy's assassination, the release of his plans for Vietnam, take all Americans out, cost him his life. That and the fact that he was definitely going to be reelected, so they would have no chance to recapitulate the things that he was ordering. So that's another thing that writers ought to be smart enough to do, is there is a very fine book, the Foreign Relations of the U.S. Volume 4, Vietnam, for the period August of 63 to December 63. It centers right in on those few months. And in it, it has, I think, 26 meetings in the White House by top people in the government on the Vietnam situation. They didn't bring in the Department of Commerce and all that stuff. Talking about Kennedy's plan. They were developing Kennedy's plans right there with Kennedy they named the people that were there every time. My boss was there at most of the meetings. When he wasn't there, he was out in Vietnam getting some information that they wanted, then came right back again.
Is that Krulak?
Krulak.
Yeah.
And all this is you can get on. I got it on a bookshelf upstairs. Anybody can walk in a government printouts and get it. And there's Kennedy's plans for Vietnam that positively say take the 1,000 men out as a token by the end of the year. We'll have everybody out by 65, and I'm not sending anybody into Vietnam. That cost him his life.
As well as a lot of other people.
It's just like the U-2 affair cost Eisenhower the chance to talk to Khrushchev and probably reach a détente. That's what his goal was. He had been working on Crusade for Peace.
Yeah,
He
right.
went to New Delhi, India. The biggest crowd ever assembled came to see him, and they planned to go to Moscow and have a bigger crowd there.
So what does somebody like Eisenhower do or think when that happens?
Oh, according,
Do you know?
yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
he has written a book, or part of a book. I forget just where I have the thing, that where he mentions that. He mentioned that Powers wasn't shot down. Eisenhower does. And from that time on, he was, he had a lot of heart attacks, and he was a very weak person, very weak man. And Nixon was almost running the government. Whenever there'd be meetings, say, for the Cuban anti-Castro program, which had nothing to do with Bay of Pigs, when Eisenhower approved it, it would always be Nixon handling the meetings. Eisenhower wouldn't be there. His last year or so, he was just a figurehead.
But did he write anything then, saying what his opinion was of the whole thing?
I don't know whether it's his own writing or somebody writing him about it. I think maybe Emmett Hughes might have written it. But it was to the fact that Eisenhower said the plane made one of its normal crash landings. He was using those words that any military man would, because it isn't a conventional landing when the U-2 comes down. But he definitely is saying that the Russians didn't shoot it down. But the best source on that is Dulles himself in the same month, in the May of 60, before the Foreign Relations Committee. Dulles says that in just plain words.
Our best judgment is that it did not happen as claimed by the Soviets. That is, we believe that it was not shot down at its operating altitude of around 70,000 feet by the Russians. We believe that it was initially forced down to a much lower altitude by some as yet undetermined mechanical malfunction. At that lower altitude, it was a sitting duck for Soviet defenses, whether fighter aircraft or ground-to-air fire or missiles. As to what happened at that lower altitude, we're not sure. The pilot may have bailed out at any time, or he may have crash landed.
You say that Khrushchev gives him a way out after the discovery. First of all, Khrushchev announces that they've caught, that they shot down a plane. He doesn't say anything else, an American plane. And then Dulles provides a cover story, which is readily disproved by the Russians because they had a whole bunch more information than what they...
They said it was gathering weather information or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, NASA was doing all the publicity. The CIA was out of the picture. It was supposed to be a NASA airplane, upper weather atmospheric checks.
And he says, in your book it says, the Russian premier was ready to say, "We are so close to the summit and to peace. I am ready to accept that this was a cruel and terrible provocation made by others without the knowledge of the American president. Let the president stand up and say that he had no knowledge of this flight, and then back up his statement by firing Allen Dulles, Dick Bissell, and those other 4 men who had pressed so hard for this flight." So I'm curious who those 4 men were, and had Allen Dulles and Dick Bissell really pressed so hard for that flight?
Well, I think in their position, they couldn't, it was their U-2. I mean, their flight had been approved. But what you had to have read earlier in there, and I'm sure you did, was that the order for no overflights was non-exclusive. In other words, nobody was authorized. I grounded all the planes I was using to fly over Asia, and we were flying in those days all the way from Taiwan up to Kokonor, and from Thailand up to Tibet, and we were just covering the area with a lot of airplanes. We just grounded them all. In fact, it probably cost us the Tibetan campaign because we were keeping the Kampas alive with food and medicine and weapons by dropping into their mountains all the time. We stopped, and they couldn't figure out what on earth had happened to us. Here we were supporting them and encouraging them to fight, and we stopped, which was a pretty bad thing to do. Well, all of a sudden, out of the clear, here comes a U-2 flight, which is an overflight. And just a short time before that, I had asked the Secretary of Defense to ask the White House for permission to fly over the Kampas with food and medicine. I said, we won't take any weapons, but the 4 guys need this. And the White House turned it down. So I knew the White House was emphasizing the fact, no overflight. Then this flight took off. Well, ostensibly, it's a CIA flight. You have to figure, since the only person in CIA that could authorize it in the final analysis is Allen Dulles. But Allen Dulles wasn't talking. So he was, and when he did talk before the Foreign Relations Committee, he said clearly, it wasn't shot down. In other words, Khrushchev is wrong. He's telling a lie. There's something else to it. And Allen Dulles was, and you can just read in the testimony how uncertain he was about the facts himself. So he was almost saying, I didn't know about that, and I wasn't sure about this. He's almost saying, I didn't send that plane out. He didn't say it that way, but if you read the transcript carefully, you get that meaning out of it.
Now, is what you're telling us here now, and Dulles' possible uncertainty about this, is this something that you have come to since writing this book? Because this paragraph sounds like Dulles and Bissell pressed so hard for this flight and 4 other people.
What I'm talking about there is not the specific flight. What I was told when I found out that they made a flight that I thought was prohibited by Eisenhower, that they must have pressed for it. What alternative was there? Later, I got a hold of a copy of the transcript, and I could see what was bothering them. And see, these transcripts don't come out immediately.
Right.
You get the things later. And what I knew from the U-2 contacts I had was that it wasn't a normal flight. And this business of getting it to be flown at all, I knew had to have been done without Eisenhower's permission, because, I'll say White House permission, because that's the people who turned me down. with the planes over Asia. There's no overflights.
The U-2 could reach 90,000 feet, much higher than Soviet MiGs or SA-2 missiles could reach. Allen Dulles briefed Colonel Andrew Goodpaster, who was Eisenhower's intermediary to the CIA. Allen Dulles stated that we were unlikely to lose a U-2, and if we did, the pilot would not survive. We were told, and it was part of an understanding of the situation, that it was almost certain that the plane would disintegrate, and that we could take it as a certainty that no pilot could survive. It's possible Gary Powers did not use the ejection seat because he may have wondered if it would have blown him up as well. The NSA reported Powers had been tracked down to 30,000 feet, and then when turning back to Sverdlovsk, was intercepted. Soviet fighter chatter revealed a pilot reporting, "He's turning! He's turning!" Soviet pilot Igor Menchikov reported in 1996 that he flew in front of the U-2 at around 30,000 feet as wash from his Su-9 broke one of Powers' wings, causing him to slowly circle to the ground. This had previously happened to a U-2 plane in September of 1958 in a mishap with a Canadian F-86 in West Germany. It has also been suggested that a Soviet mole was responsible for the malfunction. KGB officer Viktor Shmenov claimed that someone leaked the flight plan ahead of time. Colonel Prouty's view was that the sabotage was American by design, and one of the reasons for Eisenhower's distrust of the military complex. Fletcher Prouty never did reveal the names of those 4 men.